Picture this. It's 1917. The streets of New York City are buzzing with the chaos of a world at war. But on the corner of 5th Avenue and 80th Street, hidden behind gilded gates and towering limestone walls, something far darker is unfolding. Inside one of the most opulent mansions America has ever seen, a woman sits alone in a dimly lit room. Her name is Jennie Woolworth, and she is the wife of one of the richest men in the entire world. She has access to unlimited wealth. She lives in a palace that rivals the grandest estates of European royalty. Yet she is a prisoner. Not a prisoner of chains or locked doors, though some would argue those existed too, but a prisoner of her own mind. And downstairs, in another wing of this sprawling monument to excess, her daughter Edna is about to make a decision that will send shockwaves through American high society and mark the beginning of what many would later call the Woolworth curse. Welcome to the story of the Woolworth Mansion. This is not just a tale of wealth and glamour. This is a story of madness, suicide, exploitation, obsession, and the terrifying price that one family paid for achieving the American dream. This is the story of a palace that was supposed to represent triumph, but instead became a monument to tragedy. And by the end of this documentary, you will understand why this magnificent structure, worth hundreds of millions in today's money, was torn down less than a decade after its owner's death, as if New York itself wanted to forget the horrors that occurred within its walls. So sit back, because what you're about to hear will change the way you think about wealth, success, and the dark side of the Gilded Age forever. Let's begin. From nothing to everything, the rise of Frank Woolworth. To understand the mansion, you first need to understand the man who built it. Frank Winfield Woolworth was born on April 13, 1852 in Rodman, New York. His family was poor, not just struggling to make ends meet poor, but dirt floor, hand-me-down clothes, not sure where the next meal is coming from poor. His father, John Woolworth, was a farmer who could barely keep the family afloat. Young Frank grew up knowing the sting of poverty intimately. He knew what it felt like to be looked down upon, to be dismissed, to be told that he would never amount to anything. And perhaps that's what drove him. Because Frank Woolworth didn't just escape poverty, he obliterated it. He didn't just become successful, he became one of the wealthiest men in the history of the world. But how? The answer lies in a simple concept that seems obvious today, but was revolutionary in the 1870s: fixed prices. You see, in that era, shopping was a negotiation. You walked into a store, you haggled with the shopkeeper, and hopefully you walked out with what you needed at a price you could afford. It was time-consuming, intimidating for many customers, and incredibly inefficient. Frank Woolworth had a different idea. What if everything in a store cost the same fixed amount? What if customers could browse freely, touch the merchandise, and know exactly what they were going to pay? What if shopping could be easy? In 1879, after several failed attempts, Woolworth opened his first successful 5-cent store in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Everything in the store cost exactly 5 cents. No negotiation, no haggling, just simple, transparent pricing. The concept exploded. Within a decade, Woolworth had dozens of stores. Within 2 decades, he had hundreds. By the early 1900s, F.W. Woolworth Company had become the largest retail chain in the world, with over 1,000 stores across the United States, Canada, and Europe. Frank Woolworth, the poor farm boy from upstate New York, had become a titan of industry. He was rubbing shoulders with Rockefellers and Carnegies. He was invited to the most exclusive parties. He was photographed for newspapers around the world. And he decided that he needed a home to match his status. Not just any home, a palace, a monument, a statement to the world that he had arrived. That's when the idea for the Woolworth Mansion was born. Building a palace, the construction of 995th Avenue. In 1899, Frank Woolworth purchased a prime piece of real estate at 995th Avenue on the corner of 80th Street. This was, and still is, one of the most prestigious addresses in New York City. 5th Avenue was where the elite lived, the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Whitneys. And now Frank Woolworth. He hired architect Charles Pierpont Henry Gilbert, known as C.P.H. Gilbert, one of the most sought-after mansion architects of the Gilded Age. Gilbert was famous for his French Renaissance and Gothic Revival designs. He had built homes for some of the wealthiest families in America. But Woolworth didn't want just another mansion. He wanted something that would make the old money families of New York choke on their champagne. The instructions were clear: spare no expense. Construction began in 1899 and was completed in 1901. The final result was a 5-story limestone palace that covered an entire city block corner. It featured over 30 rooms, including multiple drawing rooms, a grand ballroom, a music room, a library, and private quarters for the family and their army of servants. But it wasn't just the size that made the Woolworth mansion special, it was the details. Every inch of the interior was covered in the finest materials money could buy: marble imported from Italy, gold leaf applied by craftsmen brought over from Europe, crystal chandeliers that cost more than most Americans earned in a lifetime, hand-painted murals on the ceilings, tapestries that had hung in European castles for centuries. The grand staircase alone was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, featuring intricately carved banisters and marble steps that seemed to float in the air. And then there was the Napoleon room. This is where things start to get interesting. Frank Woolworth was obsessed with Napoleon Bonaparte. Not just admired him, obsessed with him. He collected Napoleon memorabilia with a fervor that bordered on mania. Paintings, sculptures, personal artifacts, anything that had belonged to or been associated with the French emperor Woolworth wanted. In the mansion, he created an entire room dedicated to his Napoleon collection. The walls were lined with paintings of Napoleon's battles. Display cases held artifacts from Napoleon's life. A death mask of Napoleon reportedly sat on a pedestal. Woolworth would spend hours in this room, surrounded by the relics of a man who had conquered Europe but died in exile, alone and defeated. Was this admiration, or was it something darker? Many historians have noted the parallels Woolworth seemed to draw between himself and Napoleon. Both rose from humble origins to achieve extraordinary power. Both were driven by an insatiable hunger for more, and both, perhaps, sensed that their empires would not last forever. But we'll come back to that. For now, the mansion was complete. Frank Woolworth had his palace. He had his statement to the world. He had proven that he belonged among the elite. But even as he celebrated his triumph, the first cracks were beginning to show. The imprisoned wife, Jennie descent into madness. Frank Woolworth married Jennie Creighton in 1876, before his rise to fame and fortune. Jennie was a Canadian-born woman, described as gentle, kind, and devoted. She stood by Frank during the difficult early years, when his business ventures failed repeatedly and money was scarce. By all accounts, theirs was a genuine love match. But as Frank's wealth grew, something changed. Jennie began to withdraw. The woman who had once been her husband's partner became increasingly isolated. She stopped attending social functions. She stopped leaving the mansion. Eventually, she stopped leaving her room. The official diagnosis was nervous exhaustion and melancholia, the terms used in that era for what we would today recognize as severe depression and possibly early-onset dementia. But the truth was far more complicated. Jennie Woolworth was not equipped for the world her husband had thrust her into. She was a simple woman who had married a simple man. Now, suddenly, she was expected to host elaborate parties for New York's elite, to navigate the treacherous waters of high society, to be a socialite and a hostess, and a symbol of Woolworth's success. She couldn't do it. And the more she retreated, the more Frank's frustration grew. He had built this magnificent palace in part to show her what he had achieved, but she couldn't appreciate it. She couldn't even enjoy it. As the years passed, Jennie's condition deteriorated. Rumors spread through New York society about the strange woman who lived on the upper floors of the Woolworth mansion, never seen at parties, never spotted on the street. Some said she wandered the halls at night, talking to people who weren't there. Some said she screamed. Some said she had been locked away, kept hidden from the world like a shameful secret. The truth is lost to history. What we do know is that Jennie Woolworth spent her final years confined to the upper floors of the mansion that was supposed to represent her husband's love and success. She was surrounded by gold and marble and priceless art, but she was alone. When she died in 1924, 5 years after her husband, she had been a ghost in her own home for nearly 2 decades. But Jennie's madness was only the beginning of the Woolworth family's tragedies. Because while Jennie slowly lost her grip on reality, her daughters were facing horrors of their own. The suicide, Edna WOLWRTH, HUTTON's final ACT. Frank and Jennie Woolworth had 3 daughters, Helena, Edna, and Jessie. Helena and Jessie would go on to live relatively stable lives, as stable as lives of such extreme wealth could be. They married well-raised families and navigated the challenges of being Woolworth heiresses with varying degrees of success. But Edna's story is different. Edna Woolworth married Franklin Laws Hutton, a stockbroker from a respectable New York family. On the surface, it seemed like a perfect match. 2 wealthy families united, a beautiful bride, a promising groom. But behind closed doors, the marriage was a disaster. Franklin Hutton was, by all accounts, a cold and distant husband. He showed little affection for his wife. He was frequently absent, consumed by his work and his own social pursuits. Some whispered that he had affairs. Edna, like her mother, began to sink into depression. In 1912, she gave birth to a daughter, Barbara Hutton. The baby should have brought joy to the struggling marriage. Instead, it seemed to deepen Edna's despair. Perhaps it was postpartum depression. Perhaps it was the cumulative weight of years of unhappiness. Perhaps it was the family curse, that tendency toward melancholy that seemed to run through the Woolworth bloodline like a dark river. Whatever the cause, by 1917, Edna Woolworth Hutton had reached her breaking point. On May 2, 1917, Edna was found dead in her suite at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. She had taken her own life by ingesting poison. She was 36 years old. Her daughter Barbara was 5. The news sent shockwaves through New York society. A Woolworth daughter dead by her own hand. The newspapers tried to be discreet. Suicide carried an enormous stigma in that era, but the rumors spread anyway. And in the Woolworth mansion, Frank Woolworth received the news in his Napoleon room. His daughter was dead. His wife was mad. His palace, his monument to success, was becoming a mausoleum of tragedy. But the curse was not finished. Not by a long shot, the poor little rich girl, BARBARAHUTTON's tragic inheritance. Barbara Hutton was 5 years old when her mother died. She was 35 years old when her grandfather, Frank Woolworth, passed away in 1919, leaving her a fortune estimated at $25 million, equivalent to roughly $400 million today. She should have had everything. Instead, she became one of the most tragic figures in American history. Barbara Hutton was nicknamed the poor little rich girl by the press, and it was devastatingly accurate. Despite her unimaginable wealth, her life was marked by loneliness, eating disorders, failed relationships, and a desperate search for love that she never seemed to find. She married 7 times. Her husbands included a Georgian prince, a Danish count, a Hollywood playboy, a German tennis champion, and the famous actor Cary Grant. Each marriage ended in divorce or annulment. Each time she paid enormous settlements to her ex-husbands, slowly draining her fortune. She developed severe anorexia, at times weighing less than 90 pounds. She abused alcohol and prescription drugs. She gave away money recklessly, perhaps subconsciously trying to rid herself of the fortune that seemed cursed. Barbara Hutton died in 1979, alone in her suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. She was 66 years old. Despite having inherited one of the largest fortunes in American history, she had spent or given away nearly all of it. At her death, she was worth less than $3,500. The girl who had grown up in the shadow of the Woolworth mansion, surrounded by gold and marble and unimaginable luxury, died with almost nothing. Was it the money that destroyed her? Was it the loss of her mother at such a young age? Was it the Woolworth curse? Perhaps it was all three. The merchant prince's DEMONS, Frank WOLWRTH's personal darkness. We've spent a lot of time talking about the tragedies that befell the Woolworth women, but what about Frank himself? Frank Woolworth died on April 8, 1919, just 5 days before his 67th birthday. The official cause of death was septic poisoning of the teeth, a dental infection that spread to his bloodstream. But those who knew him said he had been dying for years. In his final years, Frank Woolworth changed. The driven, ambitious businessman who had built an empire became withdrawn and paranoid. He suffered from what appeared to be severe depression. He had episodes of what witnesses described as nervous collapse. He became obsessed with death. Remember that Napoleon room we talked about? In his final years, Woolworth spent more and more time there, surrounded by artifacts of a dead emperor. He reportedly told visitors that he felt a kinship with Napoleon, that he understood what it was like to build an empire and then watch it slip away. He also became increasingly paranoid about his health. He visited doctors constantly, convinced that he was suffering from various ailments. Some were real, many were imagined, but the fear was genuine. And then there were the teeth. Frank Woolworth had a notorious fear of dentists. He refused to have his teeth properly treated, even as they rotted and caused him constant pain. When he finally agreed to see a dentist in 1919, it was too late. The infection had spread. Within weeks, he was dead. Some historians have suggested that Woolworth's refusal to seek dental treatment was a form of self-destruction. That after years of watching his wife descend into madness, after his daughter's suicide, after the growing distance between himself and his remaining family, he simply gave up. We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that when Frank Woolworth died, he left behind a complicated legacy. He had revolutionized retail. He had built the tallest building in the world, the Woolworth Building, completed in 1913, which he paid for in cash. He had created a fortune that would support his descendants for generations. But he also left behind a family marked by tragedy, a wife who had lost her mind, a daughter who had taken her own life, a granddaughter who would spend her entire life searching for the love and stability that money couldn't buy. And he left behind a mansion, the Demolished, erasing the Woolworth mansion from history. After Frank Woolworth's death in 1919, the mansion at 995th Avenue stood empty. Jennie Woolworth, still alive but completely incapacitated, was cared for elsewhere. The three daughters had their own homes. The army of servants was dismissed. The grand ballroom fell silent. The crystal chandeliers gathered dust. For a few years, the mansion simply sat there, a ghost of Gilded Age excess, frozen in time. And then, in 1925, something remarkable happened. The decision was made to demolish the Woolworth mansion. Think about that for a moment. This was one of the most expensive, most elaborately decorated private homes ever built in America. It was barely 25 years old. Every inch of it had been crafted by master artisans. It contained priceless art, irreplaceable architectural details, materials that had taken centuries to create. And they tore it down. Why? The official reason was simple economics. By the 1920s, Fifth Avenue was changing. The grand mansions of the Gilded Age were being replaced by luxury apartment buildings. Land values had skyrocketed. It made more financial sense to build a multi-family building that could generate ongoing rental income than to maintain a single-family mansion. But there were whispers of other reasons. Some said the family wanted to erase the memories. The mansion had been the site of too much tragedy. Jennie's madness, the shadow of Edna's death, Frank's final dark years. The building itself had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. Others said there were stranger reasons. Servants who had worked in the mansion told stories of unexplained sounds, footsteps in empty corridors, voices in rooms that should have been vacant, the feeling of being watched. Whether these were genuine supernatural experiences or simply the product of overactive imaginations in a house marked by tragedy, we'll never know. What we do know is that by 1927, the Woolworth mansion was gone. In its place, a luxury apartment building rose, still standing today at 995th Avenue. The building is elegant, understated, and completely unremarkable. Nothing about it suggests the magnificence that once stood on the same spot. The marble was carted away, the chandeliers were sold, the Napoleon collection was dispersed, the gold leaf was scraped from the walls. It was as if New York City wanted to forget that the Woolworth mansion had ever existed. The workers who built the fortune, the dark side of Woolworth's success. We've talked a lot about the tragedies that befell the Woolworth family, but there's another dark chapter to this story that's often overlooked, the exploitation that made Woolworth's fortune possible in the first place. Frank Woolworth didn't just revolutionize retail, he revolutionized labor exploitation. The five-and-dime model worked because of razor-thin margins. To sell goods for just 5 or 10 cents and still make a profit, costs had to be cut everywhere. And the biggest cost was always labor. Woolworth stores employed almost exclusively young women, who could be paid far less than men. These Woolworth girls worked long hours in often difficult conditions for wages that barely covered their living expenses. Factory workers who produced goods for Woolworth stores fared even worse. The company relentlessly pressured suppliers to cut costs, which inevitably meant lower wages and worse conditions for workers. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911, which killed 146 garment workers, mostly young women, was in many ways connected to the Woolworth model of business. The factory produced goods for retailers like Woolworth who demanded the lowest possible prices, forcing factories to cut every corner, including safety. Frank Woolworth built his palace on Fifth Avenue with money earned from the labor of thousands of young women who would never see the inside of such a building, who could never afford the fine things he collected, who lived and died in poverty while he accumulated his millions. This is not to say that Woolworth was uniquely evil among Gilded Age industrialists. He wasn't. The exploitation of workers was standard practice at the time, but it's important to understand the full context of the Woolworth fortune. Every gold-leafed surface in that mansion, every imported marble floor, every crystal chandelier represented the accumulated labor of thousands of workers who received almost nothing in return. Perhaps this is another form of the Woolworth curse. The fortune was built on a foundation of exploitation, and perhaps it was always destined to bring misery to those who inherited it. The WOLWORTH building, a lasting monument. While the Woolworth mansion has been forgotten, erased from the New York landscape, one Woolworth monument still stands. The Woolworth building, completed in 1913, was Frank Woolworth's greatest architectural achievement. At 792 feet tall, it was the tallest building in the world at the time, a title it held for nearly 2 decades. Woolworth paid for the entire $13.5 million construction cost in cash. He wanted no debt, no mortgages, no obligations. The building was his, free and clear. Like the mansion, the Woolworth building was designed to make a statement. It was Gothic revival architecture on a massive scale, with ornate terracotta decorations, a stunning lobby that was nicknamed the Cathedral of Commerce, and a penthouse apartment that Woolworth kept for himself. But unlike the mansion, the Woolworth building was a public statement. It wasn't hidden behind gates on Fifth Avenue. It stood proudly in downtown Manhattan, visible to everyone who passed by. It was Frank Woolworth's way of saying to the world, "Look at what I have built." The building still stands today, a designated National Historic Landmark and one of the most recognizable skyscrapers in the world. Tourists still visit to marvel at its ornate lobby. Architecture students still study its innovative design. The building has outlasted the man who built it by more than a century. And perhaps that was the point. Frank Woolworth knew that mansions could be demolished, fortunes could be lost, families could be destroyed, but a building, a truly great building, could last forever. The Woolworth building is Frank Woolworth's true legacy, not the tragic mansion, not the cursed fortune, but this soaring tower of commerce and ambition. The curse continues, later generations. The tragedy of the Woolworth family didn't end with Barbara Hutton. Her son, Lance Reventlow, the child of her marriage to Danish Count Kurt von Hagen Reventlow, died in a plane crash in 1972 at the age of 36. He had spent his short life as a race car driver and playboy, never quite finding his footing despite his immense inherited wealth. Other Woolworth descendants faced their own struggles: divorces, addiction, financial troubles despite their inheritances. The patterns seemed to repeat generation after generation. Is there really such a thing as a family curse? Rationally, no. There are explanations for each tragedy: genetic predisposition to mental illness, the psychological damage of extreme wealth without purpose, the isolation that comes with being born into a fishbowl existence. But when you look at the full sweep of Woolworth family history, it's hard not to wonder. Frank Woolworth wanted to build a dynasty. He wanted his name to echo through the ages. He succeeded in some ways. The Woolworth building still bears his name, and the Woolworth's chain remained a fixture of American retail for nearly a century before finally closing in 1997. But his family, his descendants, They paid a terrible price for his ambition. The lessons of the Woolworth mansion. So what can we learn from the story of the Woolworth mansion? Perhaps the most obvious lesson is that money cannot buy happiness. This is a cliché, of course, but clichés become clichés because they're true. Frank Woolworth had essentially unlimited wealth. He could buy anything he wanted. He built a palace that rivaled the homes of European royalty. And yet his wife went mad in that palace. His daughter killed herself. His granddaughter spent her life in miserable searching for something that money couldn't provide. Woolworth himself died unhappy, surrounded by the relics of a dead emperor, having failed to find whatever it was he was looking for. Another lesson is about the transience of material things. The Woolworth mansion was built to last forever. Every material was chosen for its durability. Every detail was crafted to perfection, and yet within 25 years of its completion, it was rubble. Today, almost no one remembers that the mansion ever existed. Walk by 995th Avenue, and you'll see an ordinary apartment building. Nothing marks the spot where one of the grandest homes in American history once stood. It's as if it never existed at all. Perhaps the most sobering lesson is about the cost of ambition. Frank Woolworth drove himself relentlessly to succeed. He built an empire through sheer force of will, but in doing so, he seems to have broken something in himself and in his family. The relentless pursuit of more money, more status, more recognition, left no room for the things that actually matter. Genuine connection, emotional health, simple contentment. Woolworth got everything he wanted, and it destroyed him. What remains? If you visit New York City today, you can still see traces of the Woolworth story. The Woolworth building stands proudly at 233 Broadway, its Gothic spires reaching toward the sky. Tour of the ornate lobby are available, and for a price, you can even visit the top of the building, where Frank Woolworth once maintained a private apartment. At 995th Avenue, the apartment building that replaced the mansion still stands. It's a prestigious address, home to wealthy New Yorkers who probably have no idea what once stood on the same spot. In museums and private collections around the world, pieces of the Woolworth collection survive. Paintings, sculptures, and artifacts that were sold off after Frank's death and scattered to the winds. And in the historical record, the story of the Woolworth family lives on, a cautionary tale about wealth, ambition, and the terrible price of the American dream. The Woolworth mansion is gone, but its story endures. It's a story about a poor boy who became unimaginably rich, about a palace built to prove something to the world, about a wife who lost her mind within its gilded walls, about a daughter who chose death over continued suffering, about a granddaughter who spent her entire life searching for the love that money couldn't buy. It's a story about the darkness that can lurk behind the most beautiful facades. And it's a story that perhaps we need to remember. Because even today, in our era of tech billionaires and social media mansions, we're still chasing the same dream that Frank Woolworth chased. We still believe that more money, more success, more stuff will somehow make us happy. The story of the Woolworth mansion suggests otherwise. The palace is gone, the fortune is gone, the family is scattered and diminished. But the lesson remains. Some things cannot be bought, some hungers cannot be satisfied, some curses cannot be escaped. And some stories, no matter how long ago they happened, still have something to teach us. This has been the dark story of the Woolworth mansion. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, please like and subscribe for more documentaries about the hidden histories and forgotten tragedies of America's past. Until next time,